Hi 911A group, and I hope you all are doing well. I am posting a weekly video, and this week specifically I'm going to be talking a little bit more about writing a review of literature. I do want to mention that also within our Canvas course under the content for week 2, there is a good overview video from Dr. Pauls where she talks about the purpose of a review of literature and some of the content for a review of literature, so please still plan to watch that. But what I wanted to do was supplement that a little bit in a couple of ways. And the first is just to talk about more of the process or an approach to writing a review of literature. And then I also want to show you a couple of examples and point out some things about a review of literature and help you to pay even better attention to what those who are writing their reviews of literature within the dissertations that you're reviewing, to pay close attention to the writer moves that they're making. So you're probably wondering why there are pies on the screen. And the reason I'm talking to you a little bit about the dissertation and the review of literature with pie kind of metaphor is because I was trying to think of a way to make a connection with this process and a good comparison. You've probably heard, dissertations being compared to a lot of different things. You've heard me refer to it as being a marathon, or like your book talks about climbing a mountain and things like that. But one of the images that comes to mind for me is this idea of baking pies, and not baking pies in general, but a specific story from my past. So my grandma, before she passed away, used to always tell us a story when we were young kids about how when she and my grandpa first met and they got married, my grandpa told her that she could bake all of the pies that she wanted, but her pie would never be as good as his mom's pies. And my grandma took that on as a challenge, and she worked hard at baking the perfect pie for years and years until she finally got to the point where my grandpa conceded and said, yes, she makes the best pies. And I would absolutely agree with him, having gotten to enjoy my grandma's pies for several years. She's really well known for her pies at church and everything. And the reason that I'm bringing up that is because, just baking a pie is something that any of us could do, especially nowadays. You can Google a recipe and you can bake a pie. But just baking a pie or just writing a review of literature is not the same as writing it well. And writing a review of literature and the dissertation well requires the same amount of attention and focus and practice and practice and practice and trial and error in the same way that my grandma experienced attempting to go from making a good pie to really making the best pie. And so we'll pick up on that metaphor as I talk a little bit more about some of the next steps and how that would apply. So this lady over to the right here, you may or may not be familiar with her. She is the Pioneer Lady, and I happened to stumble upon her blog because we accidentally grew 16 mini pumpkins in our yard one year. That's because we didn't clean up our old pumpkins from when the kids had carved them. We put them on the porch. And so in our front yard, we had 16 tiny pie-sized pumpkins growing. And so I found myself with all of these pumpkins and trying to figure out how I could turn these pumpkins into some delicious pumpkin pie recipes. And so that's where I ran across the Pioneer Lady, who, if you visited her site, so you're familiar with her, just bakes the most delicious, succulent items, including recipe for pumpkin puree. And so I put her up on the screen just because she is, the kind of person for me who represented an expert in the area that I was looking to get better in. And so, in thinking about writing the review of literature, what's really important to consider is both who you're baking for and then studying the craft of people like the Pioneer Lady, who is an expert in their field. And so as you guys start to work on your review of literature, it's important that you are thinking about who is the audience that you are writing for. And when we think about writing a dissertation, that audience is really a professional audience, but it's not necessarily a specialized audience, which means that not everybody who is going to be reading my dissertation has an expertise on, for example, teaching climate change within a 5th grade classroom. So it may be teachers who are educators. It may just be educated people. It might be administrators. It might be parents. But I want to make sure that I'm covering all my bases in terms of what I need to cover. So there are some assumptions, in the field of education that we might be able to make. However, I'm also going to provide a lot more specific detail about what currently exists, and using Regina's topic as an example, what currently exists related to curriculum and climate change. And even practicing teachers may not have a good understanding of what already exists about that topic specifically. So as you're thinking about your own topic, you can think about educated audience and think about people who may be generally familiar, but you are going to have to spell out and really connect the dots regardless. And that's something that can be difficult to do as you're getting so focused on your topic, because you know a lot about it, but you need to take a step back from that and make sure that you're explaining it in a way that outsiders to this specific topic would know. And so asking yourself good questions about what might people in my field already know about this, and then what am I going to have to provide. Beyond that, and thinking about the recipe for writing a review of literature, you guys heard me say this last week, you heard me say this in our meeting, but it's really important to study the craft. So you've heard me say before that dissertations are all different, and even within reviews of literature, you're going to have to make intentional decision about what literature needs to be covered. That's something I'm more than happy to talk through with you as well. But as you're doing so, it will help you to carefully study the dissertations of other people to see, how have they made decisions about sections and subsections that they needed to include within the review of literature. People who have studied your topic, because that will help give you an idea. And as you're reading through these dissertations, as you're probably going to be returning to your other articles, look to see the different sections, see that kind of front work that they're doing before they get to their study. How are they connecting those dots? And as you're reading through, I would just jot all kinds of notes. Do I need a section on this? Do I need a section on that? Do I need a section on, because it's going to be hard to remember later. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more at the example a little bit more. But in addition to just seeing about the content, study their writing moves, I called it. So think about and carefully look at the way that they connect two different studies. How do they choose which studies to include within a section? How many studies do they include within a section? How do they compare and contrast the studies? How do they move within a review of literature to this is what has already existed, and then therefore this is the direction that you're planning to go with the topic. So in terms of your ingredients for your review of literature, to start off, sometimes people will think, oh, I have to start from scratch and I have to start searching. Well, you guys have already done a lot of work. You guys have several sources that you included, a large group of sources that you already included within your annotations in 905. And so if you haven't had a chance to look at those, or you haven't looked at those that closely, now is a good time to take inventory. And with the annotated bibliography, to some extent, you started to categorize your sources or your studies. So these studies study this demographic, these studies study that demographic, these studies found this, those studies found that. However, you are going to want to be even more intentional, and I would say kind of review your annotations to see which sources you need to look at closely. And instead of even thinking about them kind of big picture broadly, now with a review of literature, you're going to want to kind of return to those sources and mine them to figure out what specifically from each of these studies you're going to draw from. So for example, if within an annotation you said, in this source, this source provides pros and cons, strengths and weaknesses, it found this and that. Well, now you're going to want to break that down further and say, okay, well, if it talks about the pros of this, I need to address the source within the pros of my topic. And if it also talks about the drawbacks of this, I also need to talk about this source within the drawbacks. So instead of thinking about sources like within each individual source, you now very much want to pay attention to the relationship among your sources and the nuances within your sources. So really looking to see what are some of the differences in what was found, and think about for each source, how is this going to fit in my overall review of literature? So this too, as I'm thinking about taking notes for it, I would start a Word document or wherever you compose, and I would start to make notes about like sources that address this specific strategy, sources that talk about that specific strategy, and so on and so forth. So whatever themes you're kind of noticing are emerging within the previous studies, start to think about those in terms of topics and subtopics, and then make notes about which sources you might want to use where. Look through too to see where there might be gaps, where you may need additional sources, and so on and so forth. But you guys have a really good foundation to start with. And once you go with that foundation, you may realize as you're taking notes that you thought you had a lot of information on this, but you actually need more. Or as you're looking through and you see, oh, wow, I realized that I have a lot of studies that deal with climate change within a high school classroom, but I really don't have as many that deal with a middle school classroom or middle school classrooms within a specific demographic. And that can help you to know to go back and do additional research. So you're really searching strategically at this point. When you first started searching, you kind of had nothing. You had a blank slate. So anything that you found, you're like just learning. But now at this point, you're wanting to be intentional with your searches. And so this too, as you're reading through your sources, constantly be jotting down new things to search. Just because you've done a lot of searching does not mean you found everything, and you may start searching to even find little specifics, little nuances, things that you hadn't considered. And as you return to the literature, you realize oh, there could be something to this aspect of the subtopic. Also considering if there have been new studies published. Some of your topics are pretty timely, and so there's a chance that there have been additional studies published. So you will want to look at that. Just as a reminder from 905, and you probably remember this, but once you find the source, looking at cited in and cited by is incredibly useful, because scholars do that, right? They've got their own little scholar bubble. And if somebody is publishing on a specific topic, has a research interest in a topic, a lot of times scholars will research that same topic for their entire career. But you're going to start to know the players, right? You're going to start to know the people who are publishing on this topic, and then which ones you're missing. If you're noticing as you read through those sources again, I would make a note. I remember looking through and saying, ooh, I don't have this study, go find it, and I had a whole list too of studies that were cited in this study, 4 ideas for additional studies that you need to go out and find. And that's really what you want to strive for with writing a dissertation or review of literature, is what they call saturation, which means that you really looked through most of the research that exists on this topic until to the point where you start to see the same names and the same studies come up. But look through the reference list, look through their review of literature to see if there's studies that you don't have, and then go out and find those studies. So in terms of actually writing the review of literature, and this is true for the entire dissertation, it can be easy as you are getting into kind of the nitty-gritty and the details to forget, kind of to take a step back and consider the story that you're telling. So that's something that's often a weakness that I found in dissertations, is that the pieces are not connected well. And that's something you guys are going to hear me say over and over and over, is about connect the dots, remind the reader, bring the reader back to the purpose. And that's something that you'll do within each section, is you'll kind of remind the reader before the review of literature, is hey, remember what the purpose and the scope and the goal of this project was? Well, now we're going to address the literature, and this is the way that it's broken down to connect back to that story. And so some questions to kind of play in the back of your mind as you're going through and thinking about your review of literature is what is the overall story that you're telling? What is the overall purpose? And then what is the clearest, the most logical way to organize that information? And then how am I guiding readers from one point to the next? You are entrenched in this, so you're logically making these connections, but your readers may not understand why you're addressing this aspect of the topic, because it's not clear to them how this fits with the overall purpose. And so for each section you're going to notice within the review of literature, to continue to tie back, before we can look at the effects of climate change curriculum with sixth graders, we first need to more thoroughly explain the 3 models for addressing climate change within a 6th grade classroom. Now, I just made that up, but you get what I'm saying, is that you need to remind the readers, kind of step them through as they're going. This is here because of this. This is here because of that. This is here because of this. You know it, but they won't. They are going to need to be reminded of how this all connects back to what the larger goal is. Beyond that too, I threw in a little note, is that this whole process, I talked about this at the beginning, is just really messy. And so don't let that get you hung up. Make sure, you know, and you guys keep hearing me say this about writing. Some of you are like, I'm scared to write, or I don't like starting all of this. Just do it. I mean, just get something down. I don't remember if I shared with this group, but I mean, there were nights that I'd say, okay, I'm just going to write this much, and write the next day it looks horrible. But get it down on paper, and then you can go back and you can make it sound pretty. And you can talk people, you know, if you're like, I don't know which section to put first, write both sections. Maybe we'll move them around, you know. Then as you guys are like meeting with your writing groups and talking with me, we may switch the whole order of sections, but get something down as you are drafting, and then you'll be able to get back to it later. So just keep writing, just keep moving forward, and understand that the whole process is a little bit messy. So the last slide here, you know, I kind of called this my baker's tip, and just a couple of overall recommendations, and a lot of these things you know, so I won't spend too much time here. But it always really helped me. I know that there were days when I was writing my dissertation or review of literature that it helped me to do a lot of free writing, and I don't mean free writing in a very like creative, exploratory way, but writing my story first without getting bogged down by the existing literature. As much as in a review of literature, you are reviewing what other people have written, you've learned a lot of that. And so sometimes you can get so stuck on kind of going down this path on this topic, and then now your mind is just within what all these different sources are saying about kind of this subtopic. But I often would sit down, and if someone were to say to me, okay, well, your background is in service learning, tell me what you've learned about service learning. Well, I could sit down and write for hours just about what I've learned about service learning. Now, granted, I didn't remember things like, oh, in this study in 2017, but that was okay. I was able to go back later and say, okay, well, what were the studies that I wanted to cite within this section, and then kind of do that source work. But you might be able to think more logically and kind of more clearly about all of the different sections and the dots you need to connect without getting bogged down by your research and your sources. And sometimes I would even say, I remember that X found that this was beneficial, you know, with students related to future volunteerism. And then I didn't remember like what that study was, but I reminded myself, I'm going to go back and plug in the study. I just need to remember what that is. But I knew it existed because you guys already can say a lot about your topics. And so if that's kind of bogging you down, then step back from that and write what you already know, because you've learned a lot more than you may even realize. Beyond that, some questions to keep in mind as you're writing the review of literature. How does the research fit into the larger, broader issue in context? Why is it significant, important, and timely? And then in what unique ways does your research pick up where it left off? So even within each of the review of literature sections, if you talk about all of the previous curriculum related to climate change with elementary students, then at the end of that, you're saying, you know, well, these previous curricula have been implemented for the last 5 years. What is unknown is if a longer amount of time or a shorter amount of time spent on climate change has a more significant effect, or whatever the case may be. But again, you are continuing to kind of plug this in within each section of, okay, well, where now is your study going to pick up where other studies have left off? Something that's incredibly important within the review of literature is that you are connecting ideas and transitioning effectively. So using kind of sentence starters, like I would always ask myself, you know, this study found this. And then I would have another study, and I would say, well, what's the relationship between or among these 5 sources that all did similar types of research? Well, this one was longer. Well, that one was with teachers. Well, this one was with students. This one was in a 6th grade classroom. This one was within a 7th grade classroom. So figuring out how you're connecting each of your studies and how you're putting them together, knowing that you can use studies in multiple places. And so focus on what's important with that study within the context of, that theme or topic that you are addressing it. Also, I've said this quite a bit, so I don't know that I need to repeat it. It's just, again, overall that everything is going back to the overall purpose and focus. Being critical of your own work. So as you're rereading through, write it, pretend like it doesn't exist for a couple of days, and then visit again with fresh eyes. That was so helpful for me to go back, and then I would realize I hadn't even considered this, so I would see holes in my own work and my own writing, working with peer review groups, research groups that you guys are giving each other feedback, talk it out. That helps so much. I'd always say, well, what if somebody asked me, what are the key takeaways? How would I summarize that? And then, as you keep hearing me say, a lot of writing and writing and writing and writing, and then revising. But getting something down can be a really good start. And the whole thing can be recursive too, right? So some days you might feel like drafting. Great, draft. If you get into a drafting mood, go for it. Sometimes I'd spend 3 or 4 just ferociously writing, even though I was still researching. And then some days I was feeling a little stuck, and I'm like, I need to read some more of my studies to kind of get some inspiration and get my head back where it needs to be. And that's completely okay. You don't have to have all your notes before you start drafting. You can jump around within each section. You can kind of go in the direction the spirit moves you, however you want to say it. But the whole thing can be recursive. So wherever you're kind of feeling energized, that's a great place to focus your attention. So kind of quickly, because I don't want to take too much more time. I know I've already taken longer than I was hoping to take for this video, but I'll go ahead and post this one if you want to look at this one as well. But this is a sample dissertation from an EDD student who went through, I think it was the hybrid program. She did a really great job in general, and then did a really, really nice job with her review of literature. And so just to give you an example of the kind of thinking that I want for you to approach the reviews of literature that you are looking at. So this is her introduction. Notice introduction to her review of literature. So within this introduction to the review of literature, she's going to tell me what I can expect of the review of literature and how all of the ideas connect to themselves. And so she talks about this. Angelo demonstrated and preached about the respect that individuals in society may have. Demonstrated and preached about the respect that individuals in society must have for one another in order to work together, live together within the public and private sphere. Not only must the human race be able to live and work together harmoniously, but human beings must respect the democratic justices of humanity by respecting and valuing the importance of diversity. So this is really broad, okay? That's a very broad statement, okay? She's given me some context, just very broadly. Yes, we agree, this is important, okay? So now you're going to notice that she's going to start to funnel or narrow. So in order to accomplish this respect society must have for one another, it's essential to address curricular gaps within public schools. So now I'm getting a little more context. Why is she talking about this? She could be talking about this in a variety of spheres, but now we know this has to do with school. Interesting. So then she's going to say, by addressing this multicultural gap, does a nice job. I just finished up with the cultural gap, saying, okay, this needs to happen. Okay, so to address the multicultural gap, rural public high school institutions, sorry, my computer glitches here and there. By addressing a multicultural curricular gap, rural public high school institutions, their administrative, instructional faculty must be provided with the skill set and opportunities to improve for the overall diverse facets of enrolled students. So through addressing it, this and that can happen. So then she gives us a little bit of background about how multicultural education has existed. However, now I'm wondering when I read that, okay, so it has existed, so, what is still needed? As I look down, I say, okay, so because of the nature, educators struggle with this necessary components, knowledge, pedagogical framework to properly institute a multicultural curriculum, right? So rural public schools are typically comprised of students of the same racial background, creating a homogeneous group. And so this does not afford students the opportunity to work within environments of multicultural. So this is more helpful context. I get it. Now I'm realizing that this is an issue within schools, within a specific demographic of students. She goes on to talk about that a little bit more. She does a nice job with some source work here. And so then she's going to lead up to what literature I'm going to be reading about in Chapter 2, which is her review of literature. So it says, Chapter 2 exemplified the scholarly empirical research theoretical examination relative to multicultural pedagogy, global literacy, and preparedness for college in regards to being socially, emotionally, mentally ready to work within diverse environments following the graduation of high school. So now I know within the review of literature, there's going to be sections on each of these areas that she just mentioned. In addition, Chapter 2 is allowed for discussion about the various influences and positive interactions that students who are engaged within this curriculum in context have when they enter post-secondary education or workforce. So within each of these sections now, I know what to expect and I know how this fits into the larger topic. So this first section is multicultural pedagogy. So again, without spending too much more time, I'm going to look to see how she's using sources. So I see that this continued to assess, so there's some similarity there within these studies. Same thing here. I see a couple of different studies and, see how they're building upon each other and so on and so forth. So I'll go ahead and post this for you, so you're welcome to look through it on your own so we don't spend too much more time. But look to see the way that her points build on one another. Look to see the way that she uses studies throughout and how she connects the studies to make her overall background. So that's it for now. As always, let me know if you have any questions or anything. And of course, you're also welcome to bring those to our meeting on Monday. But for now, hopefully that gives you some good information to work with as you're thinking about starting to embark on that